Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back at Politics and Prose, one of my favorite bookstores anywhere, not just in Washington, D.C. I'd like to ask you, who here has seen the portrait of Kennedy in the National Portrait Gallery in the Hall of Kennedys? Ah, that's great. So you know it's quite unlike any of the other portraits. It was painted by Elaine de Kooning, who was then the estranged wife of Willem de Kooning, who we all know about. And the story behind how that portrait happened to be there, I think, is a kind of interesting one. And in fact, I opened my book with it. And I'd like to share it with you just briefly. She was supposed to paint one portrait for the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. And she was chosen because everybody knew that John F. Kennedy was too restless to sit for a portrait painter. So William Walton thought, let's get Elaine de Kooning, who was known as the fastest brush in the East. And she was supposed to spend one day, she came to Palm Beach over Christmas, spend one day, take some charcoal, take some drawings, do the portrait. Well, that's not what happened. She stayed for 4 days, and as she later explained, she became mesmerized by Kennedy's appearance, by his variety of expressions, his graceful positions of the college athlete, his incredible eyes, and finally she admitted, I fell a teeny bit in love with him. Well, I would say more than a teeny bit, because for the next year, all she drew and all she painted was John F. Kennedy. She got back to New York and she realized that she'd only seen one aspect of him, a rather important aspect. She'd seen him in person, but she decided that if she wanted to capture his essence, she was going to have to watch him whenever he came on TV and cut out the photographs from Life and from the New York Times, and she pasted them all over her wall. Pretty soon, she was working on 36 oil canvases. And she had to climb a ladder to reach them. The first picture in my book shows Elaine de Kooning reaching up to try to do something to one of her top Kennedy portraits. All right, so what had she found? I think she found what historians and biographers and journalists have found for decades since, and that is Kennedy's elusiveness, his secrecy, his passion for secrecy, and his habit of compartmentalizing his friends and aspects of his life. Ted Sorensen, his aide and speechwriter, wrote, different parts of his life, works, and thoughts were seen by many people, but no one saw it all. So de Kooning's experiences trying to capture the essence of John F. Kennedy confirmed my suspicion as I started writing this book that to discover the essence of a secretive, elusive man who compartmentalized his life, you had to look into every compartment. And to understand what he was called a prismatic president, you had to look at him through every prism. And in my case, this meant writing a narrative that wove together the personal, the political, and the presidential in ways that they each illuminated each other. And by doing that, I hope to solve what I have come to believe is the most enduring and tantalizing mystery about John F. Kennedy, not who killed him, but who he was when he was killed and where he intended to lead us. And I say intended because, of course, we can never know if he would have succeeded. So, because more than most middle-aged men and more than most presidents, Kennedy was a constant work in progress, changing, a moving target. I decided that to solve the mystery of what he would have done after Dallas if he'd survived, you had to look at the man in the last 100 days. In other words, not the JFK of the disastrous first 100 days in the Bay of Pigs, not the missile gap Cold Warrior of his 1960 campaign against Nixon, not the president who for 2 years disappointed the civil rights movement, who could not get much of his legislative program through Congress, and was reluctant to engage in arms control, and sometimes seemed paralyzed by the narrowness of his victory in 1960. Now, to understand what he accomplished and tried to accomplish in these 100 days, I think you have to go back to the inauguration and specifically to Robert Frost and the poem that Frost wrote for the occasion but couldn't deliver because of the sun bouncing off of those snowbanks on that very cold, snowy day. 2 days later, Frost came to the White House and gave Kennedy a copy of this poem and read it to him. Well, the poem celebrated the kind of courage that Kennedy had praised in Profiles in Courage, his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, and concluded by predicting, quote, a golden age of poetry and power of which this noonday's the beginning hour. As they parted, Frost turned around and said, be more Irish than Harvard. Poetry and power is the formula for another Augustan age. Don't be afraid of power. At the bottom of a typed thank you note to Frost afterwards, Kennedy scrawled, it's poetry and power all the way. Well, I say not so fast, JFK. Because there was indeed poetry in his first 2 years, in his inaugural address, in his speech during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he said that in the case of a nuclear war, quote, even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouths. But he didn't marry yet the power of the presidency to the poetry of his words. His economic advisor, Paul Samuelson, would later say that instead of a dashing and decisive president during these years, Kennedy was in fact, quote, an extremely hesitant person who checked the ice in front of him all the time. Now, in the introduction to Profiles in Courage, which I believe, unlike the rest of the book, Kennedy wrote himself, he praised the 8 senators he was about to profile for possessing, quote, the breathtaking talents of the orator, Kennedy, the brilliance of the scholar, well, maybe Kennedy, the breadth of the man above party and section, not yet Kennedy, and a belief in their integrity and the rightness of their cause, and called these heroic men people who had, quote, sailed with the wind until the decisive moment when their conscience and events propelled them into the center of the storm. Well, this is what happened to Kennedy in June of 1963. The events were first the terrifying close brush with nuclear war that happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the secret correspondence with Khrushchev that followed that and right through the rest of Kennedy's presidency, and the brutal suppression of African-American demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama in the spring of '63. In 2 successive days, in June 1963, Kennedy delivered speeches at which he at last married the power of the presidency to the poetry of his words, became more Irish than Harvard, and stopped checking the thickness of that political ice. In his June 10th commencement address at American University, he announced his own unilateral suspension of atmospheric nuclear tests and proposed negotiations in Moscow for a treaty banning nuclear testing. This was a dramatic break from the Cold War rhetoric of Eisenhower and Truman and of his own. And during this speech, he called for not merely peace for all Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace for our time, but peace for all time. Poetry married to power, because within 6 weeks, the test ban treaty had been negotiated, and signed. The next evening, he delivered a nationally televised address on civil rights that James Farmer of CORE called, quote, the strongest civil rights speech made by any president, Lincoln included. After saying that race has no place in American life or law, he announced that he was sending Congress a civil rights bill and called civil rights a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. After hearing him speak, Martin Luther King Jr. turned to a companion and said, can you believe that white man not only stepped up to the plate, he hit it over the fence? That was not the kind of thing that Martin Luther King was saying about John Kennedy just a month or two before. So during his last 100 days, Kennedy would be consumed by first negotiating the test ban treaty and then persuading the Senate to ratify it, and with getting his civil rights bill through Congress. By doing this, he was addressing what were essentially the 2 great threats to the Republic, a nuclear war and racial conflict. And he realized, more than anyone, if he could solve both of these, he would be judged a great president. he often referred to something called the High Court of History. Well, now, all presidents govern with an eye to history, but I would say that not all care equally about how the High Court is going to judge them. And if historians ranked presidents by ambition rather than achievement, I think Kennedy would be close to the top. To use Martin Luther King's metaphor, swinging for the fences from his first day in office, determined to be ranked with or above Lincoln and FDR. You know, after meeting Kennedy in the White House in 1962, Isaiah Berlin, the British philosopher, noticed that whenever Kennedy spoke about Churchill, Lenin, and Napoleon, this is quoting Berlin, his eyes shone with a particular glitter. And it was quite clear that he thought in terms of great men and what they were able to do. Berlin called his ambitions in this regard terrifying, but rather marvelous. Kennedy looked for inspiration to Churchill and de Gaulle as well as to Lincoln. Churchill and de Gaulle had worked at making themselves heroic figures and had proved that greatness can be forged in a combination of willpower and historical circumstances. In the summer of 1963, Kennedy believed that with the Civil Rights Movement and the Test Ban Treaty, he had found these circumstances. Now, one thing that I was struck by again and again as I did my research was how much Kennedy was haunted by Lincoln. And why not? Every day, every week, brought the 100th anniversary of some great event in the Civil War or Lincoln's presidency. In fact, when he commissioned Sorensen to write a first draft of his inaugural address, he told him to go study the Gettysburg Address and learn its secret. He also invited Carl Sandburg, Lincoln scholar, to the White House for a private tutorial on Lincoln's greatness and must have been pleased when Sandburg said to him, "There has never been a more favorable set of circumstances for a president to face since Lincoln." And more evidence of how much he was thinking of Lincoln after he had successfully settled the Cuban Missile Crisis, he turned to an aide and said, "Tonight is the night we should go to the theater." He also invited the historian and Lincoln expert David Herbert Donald to the White House and peppered him with questions like, how did a president acquire greatness? What separated a great from a mediocre president? Would Lincoln have been ranked a great president if he hadn't been assassinated? Afterwards, Donald wrote to a friend, "This is a man determined to go down in our history books as a great president, and he wants to know the secret." Now, in the rest of my talk, I'd like to concentrate on the ramifications of the Test Ban Treaty. Specifically, we can talk in the question period about Kennedy's personal life, his relationship with Jackie over the 100 days, and civil rights, and Vietnam as well. But I'd like to just, for right now, I'd like to show you how signing the Test Ban Treaty led to what I call Kennedy's forgotten détente. A détente largely forgotten, I think, because of Dallas, which was a kind of historical black hole that erased from public and historic memory a lot of what was going on in the 100 days beforehand. You all know how determined Kennedy was to put a man on the moon. That's not news to anybody here. But let me tell you, that's just part of this détente that I'm going to talk about. There was also, during this détente, secret negotiations with Castro through intermediaries at the same time that both Castro and Kennedy were at odds. Kennedy was trying to, had approved a program of sabotage. There was also a plan to reduce 1,000 advisors from Vietnam. But most of all, what struck me most of all is Kennedy's reversal on the space program. Now, in fact, I like to say, had Kennedy lived, we might have seen Yuri Gagarin and Neil Armstrong taking a first step for mankind together on the moon. Let me tell you why. During the 1960 campaign, Kennedy told a scientific journal that, quote, certain aspects of the exploration of space might be handled by joint efforts, and said in his inaugural address, Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars. Well, he changed his mind pretty quickly after the Soviet Union launched its first human into orbit in April 1961. Within weeks, Secretary of Defense McNamara and NASA Administrator Webb had presented him with a report recommending a program to land an American on the moon before the Soviets did. They argued that dramatic achievements in space symbolize the technological power of a nation. And although such achievements might be economically unjustified, the U.S. should pursue space projects aimed at enhancing national prestige, recognizing that competition in space was part of the battle along the fluid front of the Cold War. Now, for a keen competitor like Kennedy, a race to the moon was the ultimate competition, and he embraced it. He gave a nationally televised address to a joint session of Congress. In 1961, he compared the exploration of space to explorers like Lewis and Clarke and said that we would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. But over the next 2 years, Kennedy remained somewhat conflicted about the moon program. The romantic, the visionary Kennedy liked its daring and challenge. But the practical Kennedy, the Kennedy who checked the ice, fretted about the cost and wondered if it was just a Cold War stunt. Things began to change in the summer of 1963. At a July 20th, 1963 press conference, a reporter asked him to comment on rumors that the Russians were abandoning the moon race and whether we should reconsider our own program. He answered that America had to push on with its own program and called a moon landing important for its own sake and because it would demonstrate, quote, the capacity to dominate space. 5 days later, U.S. and Soviet negotiators in Moscow agreed on terms of the Test Ban Treaty. It was signed on August 5th. On August 26th, Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin came to the White House, to the Oval Office, and we know what went on because Kennedy had a taping system that he activated when he thought there was something interesting, particularly something he wanted to use in his memoirs. He was very competitive in advance about these memoirs. He knew that Arthur Schlesinger and Sorensen were going to write memoirs, but they wouldn't have the actual tapes of what had gone on during these important meetings. Anyway, Dobrynin tells him it's important now not to stop at what has been achieved, but to make further steps from the good start taken by us and urge that there be no slowing down of the pace. And Kennedy also said he agreed. He hoped there would be no slowing down and there'd be more agreements. But Dobrynin kept pushing and pushing. You can hear this on the tape. Kennedy, to promise more agreements. He said, let's sign a civil aviation agreement now. And Kennedy was worried about more agreements being signed before the Senate even ratified the Test Ban Treaty. And he said, well, we have to find the right time for this. Dobrynin pushed back. Finally, Kennedy said, maybe our two nations should coordinate our space programs. And then he said, since neither of us is exploring space for military purposes, the programs were largely a matter of scientific prestige, and this prestige turned out to be fleeting 3-day wonders. Does this sound like the Kennedy who said this was the great challenge and we had to be? No, this is the Kennedy after the Test Ban Treaty has been signed. He said, finally, if we're both going to the moon, we ought to go to the moon on some arrangement where we don't use so many resources for something that is, in the final analysis, not that important. This was not just an off-the-cuff remark to Dobrynin. A month later, he told NASA Administrator Webb that, quote, space has lost a lot of its glamour and wonders if beating the Russians there should be a priority. Now, the Test Ban Treaty and the Soviet insistence on following it up probably accounts for Kennedy's sudden change of mind. If, as then seemed likely, the treaty would lead to more agreements and a further reduction of Cold War tensions, then beating the Soviets to the moon was less important and harder to justify, given the cost. And a joint program could symbolize and further the emerging détente. Given the option of being remembered as the president who ended the Cold War, probably seemed like a surer path to immortality and a favorable ruling from that high court of history than putting a man on the moon ahead of the Soviet Union. Now, there were plenty of other signs of this détente throughout the fall. Khrushchev wrote Kennedy in a personal letter on September 10th that he hoped the treaty would lead to a real turning point and the end of the Cold War. British Foreign Secretary Sir Alec Douglas Home, in a speech to the United Nations General Assembly, spoke of the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And after conferring with Kennedy in early October, he told reporters, "We have begun the process of reaching a détente with the Soviet Union." CIA reports that fall spoke of Soviet hardliners, quote, discontent with the present direction of Soviet policy and Soviet moves aimed at a relaxation of tensions. The New York Times reported that the 1963 General Assembly had experienced the most harmonious start since the first session in London in January 1946. Now, at that session, when Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko visited the UN in September, Secretary of State Dean Rusk informed him that Kennedy wanted to build on the success of the Test Ban Treaty and suggested they have a private discussion of how this could occur. So they took a drive to the suburbs and walked along a suburban road without interpreters. Once they were alone, Rusk told Gromyko that Kennedy wanted to reduce the size of U.S. forces in Europe, news that would have dismayed America's NATO allies. It was an offer, Gromyko later wrote, that, quote, seized our attention. And finally, in Kennedy's speech, now long-forgotten speech to the UN General Assembly on September 20th, he began by praising the détente, saying, "Today the clouds have lifted," and then he sprang his surprise, saying that in the field of space exploration, there is room for cooperation. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. He asked why a moon flight should be a matter of national competition, why there should be duplicating research. He proposed then sending to the moon not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all our countries. And then he concluded with some poetry, a note of great optimism. I believe the problems of human destiny are not beyond the reach of human beings. He said the Test Ban Treaty was a lever and reminded the delegates that Archimedes, when explaining the principles of the lever, had said, "Give me a place where I can stand and I shall move the world. My fellow inhabitants of this planet, let us see if we can move the world to a just and lasting peace." This was big news at the time. I don't know if you can see this. This was the New York Times front page the next day. See the banner headline? It says, "Kennedy asked joint moon flight by U.S. and Soviets as peace step, urges new accords. Cold War pause. Washington is surprised by Kennedy's proposal." This was kept very close to his chest. He only told a couple of his advisors. Here's Tito says blocks are out of date. Soviet condemns China on the test ban. Anyway, I'll leave this up here and you can look at it afterwards if you'd like. Again, largely forgotten. Later, a few weeks later, there was a meeting between Kennedy and Gromyko in October, and there were more agreements. Kennedy took Gromyko away from interpreters, away from everybody else, and they went out onto the terrace in the White House, and then they had a private conversation about where they were going to go from here. And Kennedy explained that he couldn't move too fast because there were a number of hardline hawks in his own party. And he said there has to be the proper timing for this. Again, you have this feeling of Kennedy putting the brakes on the Soviets because of domestic political problems. Anyway, the test ban treaty and this détente also had a lot of effects on other aspects of the Kennedy presidency. And one of them, I can just go over one. I'm just going to talk for about another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions. I think it contributed to something that I was very skeptical about when I started my research, and that is whether Kennedy would have replaced Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. Now, this idea was thrown out by Kennedy's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, in her book in 1968. And frankly, Nobody who was close to Kennedy believed her. Let me just step back and give you some reasons why Johnson didn't fit into Kennedy's détente. First of all, he was adamantly opposed. He was more of a hawk than Kennedy on Vietnam, but was also adamantly opposed to the wheat deal. We were going to sell surplus wheat to the Soviet Union, and Kennedy saw this as an important part of the emerging détente. And Johnson was against it so much, he turned to Ken O'Donnell, Kennedy's close aide, and he said, "This is the worst political mistake Kennedy has ever made." And then he paused and he said, "And you go tell him I said that." Well, this is not going to endear Lyndon Johnson to Kennedy. Another thing happened. September 2nd, Johnson flies to Cape Cod to see Kennedy. He's about to go on one of his goodwill trips to Scandinavia, and he suddenly says, "I'd like to add Poland to the itinerary." Well, the last thing Kennedy wanted was Lyndon Johnson going to Poland. He was going to speak off the cuff. None of his speeches had been seen by the State Department. So Kennedy completely vetoed it and then said, "Well, do you have any of those speeches you're planning to deliver?" And Johnson handed the speeches he was going to deliver, and Kennedy took a pencil and crossed out a lot of stuff. I wish I could find out what he crossed out. I looked in the Johnson library. I looked in the Kennedy library. It's not there. But I guess that it was some tough Cold War rhetoric that Kennedy thought was inappropriate. Anyway, on the 12th of November, Kennedy convened the first formal meeting of his re-election team. And it's unlikely that Kennedy forgot to invite Johnson, which he did. He didn't invite him because he knew he was sensitive and he knew his feelings would be hurt. One of Kennedy's complaints about Johnson was that he was too sensitive. Sorensen said he'd been excluded because he was, quote, "not part of the inner circle and did not have the warmest relations with or full confidence of everyone in that room." And I think that includes JFK. Anyway, if Kennedy was undecided about whether to run with Johnson, it's doubtful he wanted him attending a meeting to plan an election from which he was going to be excluded. The next day, Kennedy stops at Lincoln's desk to chat as she was reading the memorandums from the meetings. And she said that staging a convention as exciting as 1960 was going to be difficult because everyone knew what was going to happen. And he said to her, "Oh, I don't know about that. There might be a change in the ticket." All right. Then, about a week later, on the 19th, the famous conversation happens between Kennedy and Lincoln, the controversial one. Kennedy's schedule was very light. He'd just been to Tampa. He'd just been to Miami. And he spent long stretches that morning sitting in the rocking chair in her office, rocking back and forth, speaking slowly. He talked about the reception in Tampa and Miami, the wonderful pictures of him and John that were going to appear in Look magazine, the famous one of John coming out of the desk. And then he said, "You know, if I'm reelected in 64, I'm going to spend more and more time making government service an honorable career." He thought it was absurd that in the space age, the chairman of a congressional committee could tie up a bill indefinitely, and told Lincoln, "I'm going to advocate changing the outmoded rules and regulations in Congress. To do this, I'll need a running mate in 64 who believes as I do." "Who is your choice of a running mate?" Lincoln asked. Looking straight ahead and without hesitation, he said, "At this time, I'm thinking about Governor Terry Sanford of North Carolina, but it will not be Lyndon." Now, Sanford was a logical replacement. He'd supported Kennedy in 1960. He was part of the enlightened New South that Kennedy wanted to court. Sanford later said that he had no doubt that Kennedy had said this, although he'd never mentioned it to him, but he thought it might have been one of those things you say just to get it off your chest. Well, others have been a lot less charitable. In his 1977 biography of Robert Kennedy, Arthur Schlesinger questioned Lincoln's veracity, writing that when he informed Bobby of her account, Bobby insisted that his brother never intended to replace Johnson, saying, "Can you imagine the president ever having a talk with Evelyn about a subject like that?" Historian Robert Caro recently writes that Schlesinger's dismissal of the Dump Johnson story is, quote, "in line with that given in virtually all books on Kennedy or Johnson," and recounts interviews with Schlesinger and Sorensen in which they told Caro that Lincoln was, quote, a flighty, rather rattle-brained woman. Well, so much for earning a BA from George Washington University in the 40s when being the daughter of a congressman and having 2 years of law school. 2 more years than John F. Kennedy had, by the way. So, what's the truth? Well, I was skeptical at first, but then I found in Box 6 of Lincoln's personal papers in the John F. Kennedy Library her notes, her shorthand notes. She said that she wrote it down in her diary. Well, her diary was actually somewhat scatterbrained. She would write on anything at hand, a piece of memo paper, an engagement book. Anyway, I found 2 sheets, 4 by 5.5-inch memorandum headed The White House, Washington, dated November 19th, 1963. And there it is, the conversation transcribed exactly as she reported it in her book. There's been recently released information that confirms that JFK was seriously considering replacing Johnson. In Ted Sorensen's 2008 memoirs, he reported that when he asked Jackie to read the manuscript of his 1965 book, Kennedy, and make comments in the margins, she deleted or modified every complimentary reference to Johnson. She criticized Sorensen's statement that the 2 men had enjoyed, quote, a deep mutual respect, writing, I think you overstate this a bit from JFK's side, and then crossed out the entire sentence. She told Sorensen that his glowing references to Johnson did not, quote, reflect President Kennedy's thinking, adding, you must know as well or better than I his steadily diminishing opinion of him then. As his term progressed, he grew more and more concerned about what would happen if LBJ ever became president. He was truly frightened at the prospect. The transcripts of Jackie Kennedy's 1964 oral history interviews with Schlesinger were published in 2011. And in them, she described her husband becoming increasingly worried about the prospect of a Johnson presidency and repeatedly saying, oh, God, can you ever imagine what would happen to the country if Lyndon was president? Well, a few days after, of course, Evelyn Lincoln's conversation with Kennedy, he was assassinated. And at the funeral, the official delegate from the Soviet Union, from Khrushchev, was First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan. Jackie took his hand and said to him, tell Mr. Khrushchev from me that my husband and Mr. Khrushchev would have brought peace to the world by working together. Now Mr. Khrushchev will have to do it alone. A comment that speaks volumes about her regard for Johnson. Anyway, finally, in conclusion, I think that the forgotten détente magnified the grief and the mourning, particularly abroad, that followed his assassination. You know, Bobby Kennedy tried to comfort Jackie afterwards by telling her that if JFK had been shot in 1961 after the Bay of Pigs, he would be remembered as the worst president ever. And he knew, both of them knew JFK well enough to know that this was actually a comforting thought. Anyway, the University of Chicago did a survey within days of the assassination, and they discovered that 53% of Americans reported crying real tears between his death and funeral. Even a third of white Southerners said that they cried. They told pollsters that they mourned him as if he was someone close, very close and dear, a result perhaps of giving a press conference that was televised every 16 days. George Bundy said he mourned him more than his father. Jimmy Carter cried for the first time since his father had died. And de Gaulle said to a friend, I am stunned. They are crying all over France. It is as if he were a Frenchman, a member of their own family. Elaine de Kooning said she felt she had lost a brother or a lover. I was crushed, she said. It was a personal loss. She threw down her brush and did not paint for an entire year. Now, because Americans and foreigners felt they knew him and that he had been almost a family member, they wanted a memorial close at hand that they could visit. And so we get the roads, bridges, highways, buildings named for him, creating this grief-stricken empire of asphalt and mortar and brick and bronze, more named for him than Lincoln or Washington. And as I say in the book, an empire so extensive that if you could extinguish every light on Earth except those illuminating something named for John F. Kennedy, astronauts launched from the Kennedy Space Center could look down and see a web of lights stretching across Europe and North America. And they'd seen more if West Virginia had changed its name to Kennediana, as it was proposed, or if Massachusetts had stamped Land of Kennedy on its license plate. George Orwell once wrote that it was impossible to prove definitively that Shakespeare had been a great author, and said there is no test of literary merit except survival, which is in itself an index of majority opinion. By that standard alone, Kennedy had been a great president. Author James McGregor Burns, who wrote the only authorized biography of JFK before the election, said, although it was an admiring biography, Burns criticized him for lacking moral passion, listening too much to his intellect, too little to his heart. In short, being more Harvard than Irish. Now, faced with explaining why a man he had faulted for lacking passion had excited such passionate grief, Burns wrote, was it that he was handsome, his wife and kids, a statesman who had cute kids? He concluded it had to be something that transcended all this. I think the transcendent reason was that Kennedy was being mourned for his promise as much as for his accomplishments, and that those accomplishments and the promise had become more evident in the 100 days preceding his assassination. I think the Israeli statesman Abba Eban put it best. After defining tragedy as the difference between what is and what might have been, Eban called Kennedy's death, quote, one of the most authentically tragic events in the history of nations. Thank you very much.
Could Kennedy have gotten the '64 Civil Rights Act through Congress?
I have my doubts about that. I do. I think that, first of all, Johnson had the assassination factor, which Kennedy wouldn't have obviously had. I think he would have passed it in '65. I think that there was an extraordinary article that came out in Look magazine shortly after Johnson was reelected, and in that they asked all of the Senate majority and minority leaders, Mansfield and Dirksen, the House, Charlie Halleck, and help me somebody. No, Dirksen was the Senate. Anyway, no, we're gonna figure this out. No, Carl Albert. All right. So now they all knew, they dealt with Johnson for years. They knew that he was a vindictive man, that he was a proud man, and that they were going to have to deal with him for 4 years. But yet, here's what they tell Look's article, What Happened to the Kennedy Program. It can't just be, trying to memorialize Kennedy. Mansfield said, the assassination made no real difference. Adoption of the tax bill and civil rights bill might have taken longer, but they would have been adopted. Dirksen said, the program was on its way before November 22nd, 1963. Its time had come. House Minority Leader Halleck said, the assassination made no difference. The program was already made. Now, these may have been exaggerations, but this is poking a stick into Johnson's eye. And I don't think these people would have said it unless they believed there was a certain amount of truth to it. Okay?
I guess my question is sort of a follow-up.
Yeah.
I'm from Massachusetts. I was a junior in high school when Kennedy died. In fact, we were at Symphony that day in Boston. But listening to you, it reminds me of the discussion of a more recent president who really was not a great success in Congress and never really was very interested in Congress. What I remember from November was that it seemed like the Civil Rights Bill and most of the other domestic agenda was kind of stuck.
Well, the Civil Rights Bill had actually gotten through the House Judiciary Committee because Halleck had backed it, and Kennedy had done some horse trading, and Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago had leaned on some people. So it was through the first hurdle. At the time, interesting, Charlie Halleck, when he got together with Kennedy afterwards, Kennedy asked him and Halleck said, well, sometimes a guy does the right thing. And then he said, well, every time I go down to Hot Springs, Georgia, is it Hot Springs or Warm Springs? He said, my colored chauffeur can't stay in the hotel. And he said, it makes me so angry. And so it was for him, it was a personal thing, too. The tax bill, I think, definitely would have passed. I don't think anybody doubts that. I think the Civil Rights Bill could have taken longer, but I think it would have been passed eventually, 65.
Because the problem in those days wasn't the Republicans, it was the Democrats.
What?
The Southern Democrats.
Exactly, that was the problem. I mean, and that's why it was getting it through the House Judiciary Committee with the support of Halleck and a lot of the Republican members was a big deal for Kennedy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. You offered to share a little bit with us about Vietnam. What evidence have you uncovered about what JFK might have done in Vietnam?
Right. Well, first of all, it is true that he increased the advisors up to 16,000. But the alternative, if he had taken the advice from all of his advisors, on I think 6 different occasions, they advised him to send combat units to Vietnam. This was suggested in 1961. I think it was Taylor and Rostow mission. I'm just not, but he was, and he refused to do it. He repeatedly refused to send combat units to Vietnam. He wouldn't do it. And he also repeatedly told friends and others in private that he would not send combat units ever, no matter what happened, and that he planned to draw down the advisors. Now, it was announced in October of 1963 the United States was that the Kennedy administration was pulling 1,000 advisors out of Vietnam with a view to having them all out by the end of 65. There's a long discussion of this in the book. I'd like to read you a few of the things, and this has come out more recently, and these are things that have been said by McGeorge Bundy, McNamara, in their oral histories and in their memoirs in the last 20 years. McNamara wrote in his memoirs that the great preponderance of President Kennedy's remarks, both before and after his interview, he was referring to an interview with Huntley and Brinkley, was that the South Vietnamese must carry the war themselves. The United States could not do it for them. In his 1970 oral history, former Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Kilpatrick said, based on my exposure to the president's view over that nearly 3-year period, I felt he was looking for an opportunity to pull back, and it would have been hard to persuade him to reverse course. He admitted it was impossible to know for sure what he would have done, but said, my view is consistent with everything he did do and said before his death, adding he would have been reluctant to involve ourselves to the extent that Johnson did. John Connolly wrote in his autobiography, my guess is that Jack Kennedy would have withdrawn American troops from Vietnam shortly into his second term. He was less charmed by the generals, and that's certainly true, than Johnson, and less susceptible to their pressures. I believe he had already concluded that the war was unwinnable. Now, Walt Rostow served in both administrations, first as an advisor to Kennedy in the White House, then in the State Department, and finally as Johnson's national security advisor. He was an unwavering hawk on Vietnam who'd pushed for a more robust American commitment. While riding a ski lift in Aspen with Marie Ritter, who told me this a couple of years ago, Rostow turned to her and said, I'm doing better with Johnson because Kennedy wouldn't listen to me about Vietnam. Anyway, there's a lot more about it in the book.
Anything about McGeorge Bundy?
Yes, I have McGeorge Bundy. Where is McGeorge? He's here.
I mentioned that because he was a kind of Svengali who certainly
Yes. In 1993, Arthur Schlesinger wrote in his diary that George Bundy told him that, quote, on reflection, he did not think that JFK would have ever sent ground forces into the Vietnam War.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thurston, as an admirer of your stellar intellect since September 1961,
Yeah.
I look forward to reading this wonderful book, and I read all of the reviews, I think, on the books. All of them said it's a great book, except the New York Times gave you a little crap. And my question is linked to that. They lead out with their headline about what ifs and what might have been. And
Yeah.
you talk about the political expediency versus principle. What would, if we're what ifing, what would the great John Fitzgerald Kennedy have done were he alive on the great error in Afghanistan and the great errors of the United States in Iraq? What would he do with Syria, which is on today's paper? Or what would he do in Egypt?
Well, given what he was intending to do in Vietnam, I find it, and his suspicion of the generals, which started with him being, of course, a junior officer in World War II, and they had a traditional suspicion of the brass, which for Kennedy was magnified by the Bay of Pigs, when all of the brass told him it was going to succeed and he should go ahead, and then for the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the brass wanted him to launch preemptive strikes. I don't think he would have listened to the military to the extent that our recent and current presidents seem to be doing, to answer that. And as for what might have been, I make it very clear in the book that I'm talking about, which I think is fair game, what Kennedy intended to do. Not what would have happened, but what he would have intended to do. Now, the corollary to that is, let's remember that this is a man who accomplished a lot of what he intended. He was the youngest elected president. He was the first Catholic president. He was determined to be a war hero. He didn't pass his physical. He finally got another physical. He got himself engineered out of intelligence so that he could be in combat in the Pacific. He ran against Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. in 1952. People said he was going to be creamed, and he bucked the Eisenhower landslide and won. He won a Pulitzer Prize. I have a thing in the book where he tries to seduce a Pulitzer Prize winner, Margaret Coit, in 1953, shortly before his marriage to Jackie, and after he fails, she won't give in to him. They are driving around Washington, and he points to the White House and says, "See that? I'm going to be there." And then he talks to her about winning a Pulitzer Prize. These are all in Margaret Coit's diaries and papers in the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, that have never been, seen before. I went down there. I found them. This all happened. There's also a very interesting moment that happens when he is trying to seduce her. And I use this in the book, talking about Kennedy being elusive. And I say that he was even elusive to himself sometimes, because when she finally rebuffs him, he springs up from the couch and he says in a kind of anguished tone of voice, "I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm glad, I'm gay, I'm sad. I don't know who I am sometimes." Written in her diary just a week later. Yeah. Hello.
Hi. Thank you for coming, and thanks for answering questions. I just have a question about your process of writing these types of books. I read the last campaign, thought it was wonderful. I enjoyed the microhistory, as you call it, of the time period. And doing a book on Jack, is that more based off of other research that you've done, or is it just a personal interest?
Well, it was actually listening to everybody talk about Obama's first 100 days. And there's 100 days, and then I thought, 100 days. Well, Kennedy, what happened in his last 100 days? Because I knew his first 100 days were not worth looking at. Yeah. So I thought, well, what happened in the last 100 days? And I knew about the test ban treaty, but there was a lot of other stuff I didn't know that came to me as I did a few weeks of research. And then a lot of the research for this book had to be done in the Kennedy Library and the oral history with the papers, because of course there are not many people alive still who had conversations with him. But luckily, a lot of the people who knew him have, of course, all written their memoirs. And also another thing is that people remember the last conversation they had with him. And so some of those conversations, I found that was very useful for the book. People remember their last words with him.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm trying to figure out which one of about a dozen questions I want to ask you, but I guess the one I'll take is on the relation to the Soviets. Now, a couple of problems there. Number one, Johnson, of course, continued for the first year, Kennedy's conciliatory line, but in October of '64, the Soviets kicked Khrushchev out, and a more hardline faction was installed.
Exactly.
Congress, for that matter, would have never allowed a joint mission. Neil Armstrong was mandated to land with an American flag.
Well, I don't know. If we say that Congress wouldn't have allowed a joint mission, and we have to remember that in 1963, people were still terrified, lived in terror of a nuclear war, and anything that was going to make that less likely. Kennedy went out west in September of 63 to go into Goldwater territory, and he was going to give these speeches about a subject that bored him. Environmental, ecology, and everything. He gave the worst speeches, some of the journalists said, of his presidency the first couple of days. Suddenly, when he got to Billings, Montana, he threw in a line about the test ban treaty and the reduction in tension, and there was applause, and there was hoots and cheers, and he threw away the rest of his speeches. And he spoke about nothing but peace. He spoke about peace and the dangers of nuclear war. People were hungry for this, I think, within a year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he had an absolutely triumphant moment at the Mormon Tabernacle when he gave probably the best received speech of that Western tour. And it went on. And afterwards, he said, "I'm going to run on peace in 1964. This is going to be my campaign, peace." But I agree. But again, that gets into the question of Khrushchev. If Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, did that have any effect on what happened to Khrushchev?
Probably not.
Anyway, thank you. Yeah, I think this will be the last one.
Okay. I just wanted to point out that the president's efforts, because of the secret correspondence between himself and the premier of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
The efforts between the president and the premier of the Soviet Union in regard to space paid off, according to Sergei, the prime minister's son, premier's son. About a week and a half or 2 weeks before Dallas, Khrushchev had accepted Kennedy's offer of going to the moon jointly.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. But on the other hand, Kennedy made this trip to the what would soon be the Kennedy Space Center, and stood underneath the Saturn missile and got so excited he rocked back and forth, and he kept saying to himself, "When this goes up, we'll be ahead of the Russians. When this goes up, we'll be ahead of the Russians." So he kind of got all excited about it again. But I think he was serious about hoping for a joint mission. Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah.